Brookfield is pleased to partner with The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. Brookfield manages real estate around the globe, collaborating with partners, tenants and local communities to bring Brookfield's properties to life. Being part of the wider Brookfield ecosystem affords access to data and expertise across a breadth of industries, in addition to access to capital. A leading portfolio of real estate, with a proven record of adding value beyond the buildings. Success built on relentless innovation, leading-edge sustainability, and the highest standards of design. The creation of places that enhance the very fabric of our communities. Brookfield, real estate reimagined.
There exists a stretch of Croatia's coastline, once dubbed the Yugoslav Riviera, that holds the remnants of a now crumbling resort. The site was, in its heyday, a sought-after getaway, but the tumultuous history of the region has left the facilities to go to ruin. So could a rebirth be on the cards for this complex, so decrepit it recently stood in for an historic battle site on the silver screen? You're listening to Tall Stories on Monocle Production, brought to you by the team behind The Urbanist. I'm Andrew Tuck. In this episode, Guy de Launey recounts how Kupari Resort went from jewel in the Adriatic crown to derelict disaster, and what's planned for its revival.
When to remodel is always a conundrum facing long-established hotels and high-end holiday accommodation, but it's almost certainly time for a radical rethink when your resort resembles a combat zone. So closely, in fact, that it's used to double for the site of a notoriously destructive Second World War battle. Kupari is just southeast of Dubrovnik on Croatia's Dalmatian coast. Bosnia and Herzegovina is just over the hill which rises behind the bay, and Montenegro is a mere 30 kilometres down the coast. It's a prime slice of Adriatic wonder. But for the 2023 film Lee, it stood in for the Normandy town of St. Malo, as Allied and Nazi forces blew it to bits in fierce fighting following the D-Day landings, all captured by Kate Winslet in her leading role as surrealist model turned war photographer Lee Miller. And not much was required in the way of set dressing, because what was once officially known as the Kupari tourist complex had, by that point, been abandoned for more than 30 years. In the early 90s, it had found itself on the front line of what Croatia now calls the Homeland War. The bombardment of the World Heritage Site of Dubrovnik made the headlines, but the ancient city was carefully restored after the fighting. As a prominent relic of Yugoslavia in a new era of Croatian independence, the Kupari complex was not so fortunate. Many of the buildings were seriously damaged by naval bombardments, and even those that weren't were left to rot. Kupari became a curiosity on the coast. Puzzled tourists could catch glimpses from their boats en route to the nearby island of Brač, but only so-called urban explorers would direct their captains to land by the derelict buildings. Among them was the ubiquitous YouTuber Mr. Beast, though he actually came in by helicopter. Perhaps he didn't fancy tackling the traffic on the D8 Dalmatian highway that runs nearby.
We just got dropped off in the middle of an abandoned city.
No stranger to hyperbole, he called the resulting video, "I survived 7 days in an abandoned city."
I feel like I'm in a zombie apocalypse. This is wild.
Never mind that Kupari is not and never has been a city, or indeed that almost 1,000 people live nearby, enjoying the services of not one, but 2 supermarkets. In fact, the Kupari complex has a long history as a getaway spot, going back more than a century. That was thanks to a pair of Czech entrepreneurs who spotted the potential for holidays on the Dalmatian coast just before the First World War. Once the fighting stopped, they set about constructing accommodation in Kupari, starting with the Hotel Strand in 1921 in a converted building that used to be part of a tile factory. The rather more swish and sizable Hotel Grand followed 2 years later. That was the work of Czech architect Jiří Štibral, who designed a suitably sprawling and palatial structure around the kiln of a former brick factory. Other buildings followed, and by the time the Second World War broke out, the Kupari complex was the most extensive resort in the Dubrovnik region. It boasted its own supplies of electricity and water, as well as more than 300 guest rooms and 2 beaches. There were also greenhouses and gardens for the kitchen of the enormous on-site Czech-French restaurant. To this day, Czechs call Croatia's Adriatic shores our coast, and all that started with Kupari. Adverts from the 1930s labelled it both the Czechoslovak seacoast and a Slavic Riviera. Not for the last time, conflict brought all that to an abrupt halt. First, Italian forces and then Nazi-allied Croatian nationalists turned the Kupari complex into a concentration camp for Dubrovnik's Jewish residents. But when Yugoslav partisans liberated the site, they claimed it for themselves. For the next 4 decades, the Kupari complex became a holiday resort for the military, with Yugoslavia's president, Josip Broz Tito, taking a personal interest. He ordered the construction of a pair of villas, one for himself, the other for his wife Jovanka. It became one of Tito's favourite places for a break, though to be fair, he had quite a few of those. It was, after all, just one of the places where he entertained Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. But the construction didn't stop with the presidential villas. The Kupari complex spread to accommodate thousands of people, with no fewer than 9 hotels, as well as villas for the most senior military officers. Even in socialist Yugoslavia, some citizens were more equal than others. The crowning glory of the Kupari complex was the Hotel Pellegrin. This was a masterpiece of modernism created by David Finzi and widely celebrated by architecture journals at the time. Viewed from the sea, this layered trapezoid on a broad base stood out against the hill behind. The bold design cunningly concealed an internal courtyard and swimming pool. It gained retrospective kudos in an exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art a few years ago. At the time of its opening in 1963, it was the largest hotel on the Adriatic, with more than 400 rooms, and after Tito's death in 1980, it opened for bookings from foreign tourists, as well as the Yugoslav military. It'd be wonderful to report that the long overdue redevelopment of the Kupari complex will revive the Hotel Pellegrin, because after more than 3 decades and several false starts, construction work is finally underway. But despite the best efforts of heritage campaigners, the Pellegrin is being torn down to make way for a new development. The site that used to be a playground for soldiers on rest and recreation will host a 4 seasons hotel and dozens of luxury villas. Plenty of 5-star comforts, but exclusive rather than egalitarian. At least the facade of the 1920s Hotel Grand will be restored, preserving at least one link to the days of the Czechoslovak seacoast, and the presidential villas of Josip and Jovanka Broz will remain state property. But there are still no plans to restore them. That's cheering news for would-be urban explorers, rather less so for those of us who value Yugoslav architectural heritage.
Tall Stories is a Monocle production from the team behind The Urbanist. This episode was written by Guy de Launey and produced and edited by David Stevens. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to receive new episodes every week. I'm Madge Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.
On The Urbanist, we're always asking what makes a city truly livable. This September, find some answers in Barcelona as Monocle hosts its annual Quality of Life conference. 3 days of panels, ideas, and good conversation with global mayors, architects, and policy pioneers, all over good food and a glass of something local. Find out more and book your seat at monocle.com/conference.